I grew up in a small town, in a modest two-story house with my parents and my older sister, Carolyn. It was a simple home, with peeling paint on the shutters and a well-kept garden where my mom planted roses every year. My father, who owned a small cafe in the town center, opened its doors daily to neighbors and friends who came for a cup of hot coffee and homemade pies. The business allowed us to live comfortably, though without excess. Mom, mostly busy with the house, occasionally helped my father at the counter, but her main focus was making our home a cozy sanctuary. My sister Carolyn was 2 years older than me, but the gap between us felt infinite. She was the kind of star that people speak of with admiration. Her accomplishments sparkled: school presentations that drew applause, leadership in clubs, excellent grades. Mom looked at her as if she were a precious gem that shone brighter with each passing year. "Carolyn, dear, that presentation was absolutely brilliant," I remember Mom saying one evening after a school event. I stood in the doorway, holding my certificate for participation in a science fair, but no one noticed. It seemed like no one even tried. It was always like that. Carolyn shone, and I remained somewhere in the shadow of her brilliance. Comparisons always worked in her favor. When Carolyn got a new iPhone, I got her old one with a cracked screen. When she wore designer dresses, I received her neatly folded clothes from the previous season. Every family gathering became a mini showcase of her achievements. Have you heard about Carolyn's results? She's in the top percentile on the SAT. Dad would proudly announce to relatives, adding that she was also president of the debate club. I learned to stay quiet in those moments, knowing that my steady B's and my position as treasurer of the environmental club weren't worth mentioning. It wasn't that my life was bad. I had it fine, but in a house where fine was viewed as failure, it felt different. I remember helping my mom fold laundry one day when she, setting aside another shirt, said, "Pamela, you should consider practical career options. Maybe something in retail or the service industry. There's nothing wrong with honest work." She didn't realize how her words stabbed into me like a dagger. I had grown used to the constant hints, to the idea that I supposedly had certain limitations that held me back. But I could never get used to how everything around me seemed to emphasize them. Looking back now, I realized those years were a preparation for a future I couldn't have predicted at the time. The constant comparisons, subtle jabs, and clear messages that I was less than Carolyn left scars. Those scars healed slowly but became a driving force I didn't yet understand. No one in my family could have guessed how their behavior would shape our future. I remember the day Carolyn received her college acceptance letter. It was one of the best universities in the country, and our home was filled with joy. Mom beamed like never before, cooking her favorite dinner, and Dad brought out an expensive bottle of wine they opened that evening as they discussed her future plans. Our brilliant girl got into the best college in the city. "We've been waiting for this moment since she was born," Mom said, looking at Carolyn with pride. I sat at the dinner table, pushing food around on my plate, dreaming of what my own celebration might look like in 2 years. When it was my turn to apply to colleges, I waited with bated breath. But the response was completely different. I didn't give up. Every morning began with me sitting at my laptop, combing through job listings and sending out resumes to dozens of companies. I even agreed to unpaid internships just to get my foot in the door somewhere. My only refuge and source of support became my grandparents' home. Their smaller but cozier new apartment was a place where I could hide from failure and worry. Grandma would make her signature apple pie, and Grandpa would bring books on investing and motivation from the library, saying, "Knowledge is capital that can't be devalued." But the job market remained unforgiving. Sometimes it felt like, despite my degree and knowledge, I was invisible to employers. One day, I went to an interview at a small financial company, and the interviewer, glancing briefly at my resume, dismissively remarked, "Your degree is fine, but where's the experience?" His words echoed in my mind the rest of the day. How could I gain experience if no one would give me a chance? Every night, I woke up with a sense of anxiety. Bills were piling up, and my savings were quickly disappearing. I tried not to show my worry to my grandparents, but their eyes betrayed that they understood everything. One day, Grandma sat down next to me and quietly said, "You're strong, Pamela. I know this isn't easy, but you've already proven you can get through so much. Just trust yourself." Those words ignited something within me. I realized I could no longer sit and wait for someone to open a door for me. The next day, I made a decision. If no one would give me an opportunity, I would create one myself. I began offering financial planning consultations to local residents. My first client was my grandparents' elderly neighbor, Mr. Harper, who wanted to figure out how to manage his modest pension. I explained the basics of investing, helped him create a simple plan, and he was so grateful that he told his friends about me. Slowly but surely, word of mouth did its work. People started coming to me for advice. I worked out of a small room in my grandparents' home, at a desk my grandfather had repurposed from an old dresser. The work was modest, but for me, it was a start. And most importantly, I began to feel valuable again. With each new client, I gained experience, learned to listen to people, understand their fears and dreams, and help them see opportunities they might have overlooked. After a few months, my consulting work began to bring in a modest income. It wasn't the kind of success I had dreamed of, but I was proud of myself. After all, I had started from scratch, without any support from my family. One day, a local entrepreneur, Mr. Craig, approached me for help in optimizing the expenses of his small business. It was my first major assignment. I worked day and night, studying his business and drafting recommendations, and in the end, he was satisfied with the results. But the most unexpected part came after the project was completed. He asked, "Why are you still working from home? You have talent, but you need more opportunities. I want to introduce you to someone." That someone turned out to be a managing partner at an investment firm in a neighboring city. Shortly after our meeting, I was offered a position as a junior analyst. It wasn't just my first serious job, it was also my chance to break free from the limitations that had held me back for so long. I remember the day the official offer letter arrived. I came home with the envelope in my hands, tears of joy streaming down my face. My grandparents were home, and when I shared the news with them, they both hugged me tightly, unable to hide their emotions. Grandpa, holding back tears, said, "I always knew you'd go far, Pamela. Your grandmother and I are so proud of you." The next day, I headed to the new city to start my job. It wasn't just a step toward my career, it was a step toward a new life, one I had built on my own. There were many challenges ahead, but now I knew I could handle anything. As I stepped onto the cold asphalt of the street, the night air stung my lungs. I walked quickly away from Carolyn's house, holding back tears that already burned my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as anger and resentment swirled inside me, transforming into a boiling volcano of emotions. Their words echoed in my head, the mocking, the disdain, the condescending looks. All of it felt like a return to my childhood, when I was repeatedly compared to Carolyn, with her always being placed above me. But now, I was no longer the silent girl who patiently endured the jabs. Now, I knew my worth. I knew that everything I had achieved was the result of my own efforts. No one had helped me, not my parents, not Carolyn, not her polished boyfriend, who looked at me as if I were invisible. I reached the bus stop and paused, catching my breath. A thought flashed through my mind. Why did I even come to that dinner? Deep down, I must have still hoped that something would change. But no, they remained the same. When I returned to my small apartment, I barely managed to close the door before letting the tears flow. I wasn't crying out of weakness, but out of anger. Their words reminded me once again how many times in my life I had to prove that I wasn't less capable, less intelligent, less deserving. And now I was in my own home, modest as it was, but it was mine, paid for with my own efforts. Neither they nor anyone else could take that sense of accomplishment away from me. The following days passed in a daze. My job at the retail company was routine, but I knew it was just a stepping stone, a bridge to something greater. In the evenings, I made plans, studied job postings at larger companies, sent out resumes, and took online courses. Inside, I was fueled by the determination to prove them wrong. Wrong about everything. One day, a few weeks after that dinner, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Mr. Craig, the entrepreneur I had once helped optimize his business. I hadn't heard from him in a long time and had assumed he'd forgotten about me. But his voice on the other end of the line was as confident as ever. "Pamela, I've been thinking. You're exactly the person I need for a new project. We're planning to launch something like a consulting center for small businesses. I need someone with your analytical skills. What do you think?" I froze. This offer felt like a breath of fresh air after days of doubt and anxiety. Inside, I was elated. I knew this was my chance, my way forward. "That sounds incredible, Mr. Craig. When can I start?" I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Can you stop by the office tomorrow? I'd like to discuss the details in person." The next day, I stood outside the office, located in a modern building in the city's business district. This place was nothing like my retail company with its dusty shelves and creaky chairs. Here, the atmosphere exuded professionalism and forward momentum. The meeting went well. I could feel that Mr. Craig genuinely valued my work, not just seeing me as someone with a degree. Soon, I officially began working on the project. My responsibilities included consulting small business owners, helping them draft strategies, plan budgets, and find investors. It was demanding work, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. I was respected, people listened to me, and most importantly, I felt that what I was doing truly mattered. Every evening, as I returned home, I reflected on how far I had come. In my small but cozy apartment, I would sit down at my laptop to continue studying or look at a map of the city, planning which companies I wanted to conquer next. My goal was clear. I didn't just want to prove something to my family. I wanted to prove it to myself, that I was capable of more than they ever thought, more than I once thought myself. One evening, after a long day, I overheard a neighbor's child say to his mother, "Mom, that girl from the apartment across the hall, she seems like she works at some important place. She always looks so confident." Those words made me smile. I wasn't just changing my life, perhaps, in some small way, I was inspiring someone else too. And now, standing by the window, I looked out at the lights of the city at night. This was my new home, my new world, built with my own hands. There was still so much ahead to achieve, but I knew I was ready. I let my gaze linger on Carolyn, allowing her astonishment to hang in the air like a heavy cloud, ready to burst into rain. She stood across from me, dressed impeccably in her designer outfit, but her face showed confusion. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. I, on the other hand, felt complete calm and control. This was me, the real me, standing in front of her, and I knew she could see it. "What do you think, Carolyn?" I raised an eyebrow, took another sip of coffee, and finally allowed myself a faint smile. "I live here." Her eyes widened as if I had just announced I planned to buy the entire city. She let out a nervous laugh, but it sounded strained, almost fake. "Here? In this building?" She glanced back at the high rise behind me, as if to confirm she'd heard correctly. "That's right," I nodded, savoring her confusion. "In one of the apartments overlooking the park. If I'm not mistaken, it's on the same floor as the penthouses. What about you? What brings you here?" I pretended to be genuinely curious about her answer, though I knew the question would only fuel her unease. Carolyn cleared her throat and attempted to regain her composure, adjusting her perfectly styled hair. I was just out for a walk after my workout. I had the day off and thought I'd take a stroll. She hesitated, her gaze flitting nervously across my face. And how about you? You're still working at that retail company, right? I smirked. The question was so predictable. Carolyn was clinging to what little she knew about my past, trying to downplay my present success, still unaware of how far I'd come. That was a long time ago, I replied, carefully choosing my words. I'm now the head of the investment division at Maxwell Investment Group. I paused, giving her time to process the information. We recently opened a new office in the city, and I'm one of the people helping to grow it. Carolyn tried to maintain a neutral expression, but I caught the brief widening of her eyes before she could stop herself. Maxwell Investment, she stammered, clearly not expecting to hear that name. That's a major firm. I've heard of them. Yes, one of the best, I confirmed, savoring every moment of the conversation. By the way, if you or your boyfriend ever think about reinvesting or diversifying, feel free to reach out to me. I winked, knowing my tone exuded just the right amount of confidence. Carolyn gave a nervous smile, but it was filled with uncertainty. For once, it seemed she genuinely didn't know what to say. That's impressive, Pamela, she finally managed. I'm happy for you. Thank you, I replied, pressing my lips together to hide a smirk. You know, Carolyn, life is full of surprises. You never know how it's going to turn out. She nodded slowly, and I noticed something flicker in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, a mix of envy and uncertainty. Carolyn, who had always seen herself as superior, now stood before me, unsure how to respond to my success. It was a moment I had longed to experience my entire life. But, to my surprise, I didn't feel triumph. Instead, I felt a sense of lightness. It was freedom from her shadow, from the need to prove myself to anyone, from the past that had always held me back. I need to go, I said, glancing at my watch. I have a meeting at the office in half an hour. It was nice seeing you, Carolyn. I didn't wait for her response. I simply turned and headed toward my car parked by the curb. It gleamed in the sunlight, and I noticed Carolyn steal a quick glance at it. It was the car I had bought after my first big success, a symbol of the journey I had taken. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror. She remained rooted to the spot, confused and, perhaps for the first time in her life, unsure of what to do. I started the engine, and in that moment, everything inside me clicked into place. I didn't look back. I thought of them, feeling the anger and resentment rise within me like a hot wave, impossible to suppress. Their behavior, from awkward glances to tense silences, only fueled those feelings. They hadn't come to check on me, to say they were proud of me, or to show even the slightest interest in my life. They had come for money. For a huge sum they believed was rightfully theirs simply because I had made it. Pamela, you have to understand, my mother began, her voice softening to a near-pleading tone, as though playing on emotions might work. This isn't for us. It's for Carolyn. Her future, her happiness, her reputation. We know you can help, and it won't be a problem for you, right? I raised my hand to stop her stream of excuses. Enough, I said, my voice firm and cold. You don't even understand how insulting this is. You're not here for me. You only care about me now because I've achieved something in my life. You think I owe you something. But I owe you nothing. My father cleared his throat, his face flushed, clearly ready to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. When I needed a chance, you refused me. You didn't just fail to help, you did everything you could to make me believe I couldn't make it. You left me alone with dreams that you thought were impossible. And now you come here asking me for $150,000. For Carolyn's wedding? My mother opened her mouth to object, but I couldn't hold back anymore. Where were you when I stayed up all night with my books, trying to make it? Where were you when I ate cheap ramen because I couldn't afford anything else? When I worked 3 jobs just to survive? And where were you when Grandpa sold his house to pay for my college? I paused, giving them a moment to process my words, but their faces remained stony, as if they were just waiting for their turn to speak again. You never believed in me. Not once. And now you show up, acting like nothing happened, asking for my help. I laughed, but it was filled more with bitterness than humor. I'm not giving you that money. Not as a loan, not as a gift. That's my hard work, my life, and I'm not going to let you use me the way you've used everyone else. Pamela, you've got it all wrong, my father interrupted, his voice hollow, as though he already knew it was pointless. This is for the family. For our family. We've always supported each other. You didn't support me, I shot back. You supported Carolyn. Always Carolyn. And you know what? I don't blame you for that. Maybe she was your favorite child, maybe you saw something in her that you didn't see in me. But don't you dare talk to me about family support. The only people who ever supported me when it mattered were Grandma and Grandpa. Not you. My mother's face flushed red, and she finally dropped her diplomatic tone. You're ungrateful. We did everything we could for you. Everything you could. I repeated, my words dripping with sarcasm. Everything you could was making me feel like I'd never be good enough. Everything you could was refusing me a chance at an education. Everything you could was painting me as a failure while Carolyn got everything. No, Mom. You did everything you could to show me that I meant nothing to you. Silence fell. The tension in the room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. They exchanged glances, as if trying to decide what to do next. We thought you had changed, my mother finally said, her voice trembling. We thought you'd understand. We're family. Family? I scoffed. Family is Grandma and Grandpa, who gave up everything to ensure my future. And you? You're just people who want something from me. That's not family. They didn't say anything more. They sat there in silence as I stared at them with complete composure. Inside, I felt no pain, no anger, no resentment. Only certainty. I think we're done here, I said, heading toward the door. I'm not discussing this further. You know the way out. My mother mumbled something, but I wasn't listening anymore. I opened the door, and they left without looking back. As I closed the door behind them, I felt lighter than I had in years. This wasn't just a victory in an argument. It was a final break with a past that no longer had any hold on me. I felt the wave of anger and disappointment rising within me, but being with Grandma and Grandpa allowed me to keep it under control. Their calm, their wisdom, their unconditional love had always been my anchor. I looked at Grandma, at her caring, wrinkled hands holding mine, and at Grandpa, who sat across from me with a look of pride and resolve on his face. These 2 people were my real family, and in that moment, I realized I didn't need approval from anyone who had never truly valued me. Thank you, I said softly, struggling to hold back tears. For everything. For always being on my side, even when no one else believed in me. You're our girl, Pamela, Grandma replied, her voice soft but full of strength. We're proud of you, and we're happy to see you achieving what you've always dreamed of. Grandpa nodded, his gaze steady on me. Don't let them back into your life, girl. They missed their chance to be your family, and that's on them, not you. I smiled, feeling the weight I'd carried for so many years begin to lift. This was a moment of clarity. They were right. I didn't owe anyone anything, and I wouldn't let my parents or Carolyn manipulate me ever again. We continued dinner, talking about everyday things, how the garden behind their house was growing, new recipes Grandma wanted to try, old family stories Grandpa had told me when I was a child. This home, filled with warmth and love, was the only place where I truly felt safe. When I left them that evening, I felt light again, as if the weight of years had been lifted off my shoulders. But that peace didn't last long. The next day, just as I got to the office, my phone rang again. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I sighed, hoping it was just a colleague or a client, but instead, I heard my mother's voice. "Pamela, we need to talk." "It's important," she said, her tone softer than usual. "Can we meet?" "I'm at work," I replied coldly, determined not to fall for her tone. "What is this about?" "It's about your grandfather," she said, and for a moment, I felt my heart stop. "He's having health issues." I tensed immediately. "What?" I gripped the phone, panic rising in me. "What's wrong with him?" "I'm not sure," she continued. "We heard about it from a neighbor." "Maybe you should check on him." "I thought you should know." My thoughts started racing. Why were they telling me this so coldly, so detached? And if they knew, why hadn't they done anything to help? Too many questions swirled in my head, making it hard to think clearly. "Thanks for the information," I snapped and hung up before she could respond. I immediately dialed my grandmother's number. After several agonizing rings, I finally heard her voice. "Pamela?" "What's wrong, dear?" "Grandma, is everything okay? Is Grandpa all right?" I could barely keep my voice steady, trying to suppress the fear building inside me. She laughed, and the sound instantly calmed me. "Of course, everything's fine. Why do you ask?" I felt the tension leave me, but anger began to rise in its place. Why had my mother decided to scare me like that? Was this yet another attempt at manipulation? "Just wanted to check," I said, trying to hide the edge in my voice so Grandma wouldn't notice my frustration. "Everything's okay?" "Everything's wonderful, dear," she assured me. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I'm fine," I replied, now smiling genuinely. I just got worried. After that call, I couldn't focus on work. I knew my parents were trying to make me feel vulnerable again, to pull me back into their web. But it hadn't worked. This time, I wasn't going to fall for it. That evening, on my way home, I made a final decision. I would no longer allow them to be part of my life. I wouldn't answer their calls or give them more chances to hurt me. Grandma and Grandpa were my real family. Everything else was just noise from a past I could leave behind. I turned to Carolyn, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion bubbling inside me. She stood next to me, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a designer dress and a ring that could have covered several months of rent in my old apartment. Her eyes held that same blend of entitlement and calculation I'd seen in childhood, back when she always got everything she wanted. "Carolyn," I said slowly, brushing her hand off my shoulder, "do you even realize how this looks? You came here, trying to present your request as an attempt to reconcile, but all you really want is money. You're not even trying to hide it." Her smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "That's not true, Pamela. I really do want us to be closer. We're family, and I was hoping you'd understand how important this is for all of us." I laughed bitterly, without joy. "Family?" I repeated, locking eyes with her. "Carolyn, you have no idea what that word means. If you did, you wouldn't show up only when you needed something. You would have been there for me when I was struggling to survive. You wouldn't have mocked me for my job, my apartment, or my life." She looked away, but she still stood there, as if hoping I'd change my mind. "Listen," I continued, calmer now, "you have your parents, who have always supported you. They saved up for your college, they celebrated every step you took, They bragged about all your accomplishments. They're your family. And me? I was just the background. A shadow. You can't just show up now and expect me to save all of you just because I finally made it. I'm not demanding anything, she said, but her voice was weaker than usual. I'm just asking. You can afford it. This isn't that much money for you. Not that much money? I nearly laughed again. Carolyn, you're asking for $150,000. That's not just money. That's my hard work, my effort, my sleepless nights spent on projects. You have no idea what it took for me to get here. She sighed, her perfect confidence finally cracking. I don't know what else to say, Pamela. This is my wedding. It's the most important event of my life. If I embarrass myself in front of Thomas's family, it's unthinkable. Then don't live a life you can't afford, I snapped. If your wedding depends on how much money you can scrape together, maybe it's time to rethink your priorities. Carolyn opened her mouth, but I raised my hand to stop her. And no, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm just telling you the truth. You want to impress his family, not build a strong relationship. Isn't that absurd? You're afraid they'll find out that your parents aren't as wealthy as they pretend to be. And then what? Are you going to spend your entire life lying just to meet their expectations? Her face flushed, and she turned toward the window. You don't understand, she finally said, her voice trembling. It's different. You don't know what it's like to be in my position. You're right, I replied. I don't know what it's like to be you. But I do know what it's like to be underestimated, to be laughed at, to be made to feel like you're not good enough. And you know what? I went through it and came out stronger. You can too. But you need to understand something. I'm not going to fix your problems anymore. I have my own life. She turned to me, her face hard, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You really have changed, Pamela, she said bitterly. You've become cold. You would have never acted like this before. I held her gaze, unflinching. Yes, I've changed, I said calmly. Because I had to. Because I couldn't keep being the person you all wanted me to be. I don't let people use me anymore. She said nothing. She just stood there, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. Finally, she sighed, grabbed her bag, and headed for the door. You know, I thought you'd want to help, she said, her voice heavy with resentment. That despite everything, you were still my sister. I didn't respond. I just watched as she opened the door and left, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. When the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't anger, nor was it disappointment. It was freedom. I walked back to the window, looking out at the city lights. I knew there would be more conversations, gossip, and judgment ahead. But none of that mattered anymore. For the first time, I was living my life without looking back. Sitting by the large window in my apartment, I watched as the city bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The noise of the streets, muffled by the glass, blended with my thoughts, which revolved around the events of the past few weeks. Everything that had happened since Carolyn showed up at my door felt like a scene from a play, except now, I wasn't an actress, I was the director. I no longer conformed to their expectations, tried to please them, or justified myself. This sense of freedom was new and exhilarating. A notification lit up my phone screen, a message from Sarah. She was perhaps the only person from Carolyn's circle who had ever treated me with genuine kindness. You need to see this, the message read, followed by a link to a social media post. I clicked the link and found a short video, Carolyn and Thomas at some formal event, surrounded by a well-dressed crowd. Carolyn looked flawless as always, but her smile was as forced as it had been in her wedding photos. Thomas was speaking, his expression a mixture of arrogance and weariness, while behind them, I spotted my parents standing slightly off to the side, like guests who didn't quite belong. I closed the video and set my phone aside. I didn't need to watch more to understand what was happening. Carolyn was still living in a world where everything revolved around other people's expectations, where every detail of her life had to fit an idealized picture. But beneath all that glitter was an emptiness that no designer dress or luxury home could fill. I knew my parents felt that emptiness too, trying to keep up with new standards that didn't belong to them. I finished my wine and thought about how far I'd come from all of that. My world was different. It was real. There was no place for pretense or artificial shine here. My achievements were my own, and my relationships were genuine, built with people who loved me for who I was, not for how I looked. The next day, I visited my grandparents. Their home always smelled of freshly baked goods and something calming, as if the very atmosphere was infused with warmth and care. Grandpa was in the garden, quietly humming a tune to himself, while Grandma stood in the doorway, waving a dish towel at me as though I were a guest she'd been eagerly awaiting all day. "You look wonderful," Grandma said, giving me a once-over. "Work isn't wearing you out too much, is it?" "No, Grandma. Work is great," I replied, sitting down at the kitchen table, where a freshly baked pie was already waiting. "How are you both doing?" "We're doing just fine, dear," she said, taking a seat across from me. "We've been thinking a lot about how far you've come. We're so proud of you." I smiled, feeling the warmth of her words. Unlike my parents, my grandparents had never asked anything of me except for my happiness. They had supported me even when they themselves needed support. Their sacrifices had lifted me up, and I would always be grateful to them for that. We spent the evening talking about everything: the books I'd been reading, plans for the weekend, their new recipes. But eventually, the conversation returned to a topic I had been trying to avoid. "Your parents," Grandma began cautiously. "Have they tried to reach out?" "No," I replied calmly. "And you know what? It's for the best." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unbidden tears. "You've always been strong, Pamela. Even when we could see how hard it was for you. But you should know that to us, you've always been more than just strong. You've been our hope." I stood and hugged her tightly, feeling tears well up in my own eyes. Grandpa, hearing our voices, peeked into the room and, realizing we were embracing, joined us. The three of us stood there, in the small, cozy kitchen, and in that moment, I knew this was family. Not the kind that sets rules, not the kind that measures you by your accomplishments, but the kind that loves you simply for who you are. On the way back to the city, I stopped by the lake, the place I used to visit alone as a teenager. The water lapped gently against the rocks, and I sat on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I thought about my life, how far I'd come, and how much farther I still had to go. Yes, the bridges I had burned would remain ash. But on that ash, I would build something new, something better. It would be my own world, a world where I would never again let anyone decide who I am or what I'm worth.